Time now for Perspective. My guest today is Fabien Truong, sociologist, author and associate professor at the University of Paris. A former school teacher, Fabien spent a decade following the lives of around 20 of his students, charting their progress from the time they took their baccalaureate or the end of school exams here in France to when they finished their final studies. Those 10 years took in the riots that rocked France back in 2005 to the terror attacks of January 2015. Well, after publishing several investigative books and producing a documentary, Fabien has just released his first novel, La Taille des Arbres, or translated into English, that would be The Size of Trees. It examines the effects of immigration and colonialism on young children via stopovers in Vietnam and New Caledonia. Thanks for joining us, Fabien.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Fabien, your own experience as the son of an immigrant who came to France from Vietnam, does that colour your perspective when you're talking to these people writing this particular novel, your first one?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, as you said, I spent years of trying to understand the questions of where I'm coming from, origins, from my former students, because like you mentioned, in the outskirts of Paris, it's the immigration, the questions related to immigrations are really important. And I realized also that I had this particular story in me because my dad is Vietnamese, and that I never really investigated this side. And in this book, because we're traveling to Vietnam and also New Caledonia, it was a way to question myself as well with all these younger persons, and so as a way to start to do a personal inquiry, I guess, through the means of literature.
And the book, of course, it comes at a very timely moment here in France, just a couple of months before the presidential elections. How concerned are you about some of the rhetoric that's coming from the far right in particular, but it's also been incorporated into the dialogue coming from some of the more mainstream candidates during this campaign? How concerning is that to you?
Well, you can see the glass half full or half empty, I suppose. In many ways, it's very concerning because it's always more and more stigmatization and more culturalist, lazy conversations, because a lot of candidates tend to put people in really black and white boxes. And this is actually not what's happening on the ground. One of the kids that I've been working with, named Youssef, was saying to me, he said, the problem is not that we're not French. We do feel French, but we're not French, which means we're not perceived as French by a lot of the people. So, and this rhetoric is really concerning because it's really out of the ground. I mean, that's totally not how, if you spend a bit of time in the ground, it's totally irrelevant. And maybe that's the glass half full. Those kind of discourses, they're not rooted in something really, and they feed on fear. And it tells a lot, I guess, about how a lot of media and politicians are out of touch with a large part of the population, which you can clearly see in those elections. I mean, we're talking about an election where the president might be only elected by 15 or 20% of the people because of the dynamics of this election, which I think tell a lot in between the gap between what's going on the ground, and especially if you talk about immigration, suburbs, youth. All these subjects are heavily politicized, but are not really understood for the ground. The idea is to produce images, clash on TV shows just to attract the attention, but it's this is so far out of the real topics and the real questions that bother people on the ground. So that's half full, half empty, depends on how you
because when we're hearing all this media commentary, the newspapers as well talking about France being in decline, lots of talk of immigration, but polls show that people are actually more concerned about things like the price of living and paying their daily bills. But let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that are facing these young men living in particular suburbs just outside Paris. What are the kind of challenges facing them?
Well, you cannot name it. The main question is poverty. That's the first question, and then the other question is the idea of being secluded and sent apart from the main society. But when you mentioned that, one should also see that there's a dynamics that is not really talked in the media, because in the media we always talk about problems, social problems, which are, you know, they are here, but they are here because also there's a dynamics, and I mentioned the glass half full and half empty, and if you look at the suburbs and the outskirts, the reason why they're getting poorer and poorer is also because there's a big proportion of people who leave the suburbs, which means basically in France the pattern is that when a family starts to make it like socially or economically, they leave the suburbs. So the reason also why these places are getting more and more poor is because a lot of people are also moving out, and they are part of the main society. So if you ask the regular French people, they know a lot of people have grown in the suburbs that have no immigration background, just because the population is also spreading out in the country. But the problem is that the urban outskirts are getting poorer and poorer because of this dynamic. So again, there's those two dimensions, that those sort of like really fixed images don't really tell and show, and that's why they're so irrelevant.
It contrasts wildly with what's happening on the ground. Fabien Truong, thank you so much for joining us. That's Fabien Truong, sociologist, author and associate professor at the University of Paris.
Thanks for having me.